Hey guys, so before we get into today's video, I want to tell you about what may be the most interesting lecture series I have found about the evidence for the claims of the church. It's a channel on YouTube called LDS Truth Claims. Brett McDonald presents 32 lectures covering all of the positive evidence for the church and also deals with essentially every major objection to the church's truth claims. Brett does this systematically with attorney-like rigor. I actually listened to his entire series over a couple of months while doing the dishes. It really helped me realize that saints often never consider how much positive evidence exists for our claims. I highly suggest this series to all Latter-day Saints. Just search for LDS Truth Claims on YouTube. Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's show. I'm your host, Jacob Hansen, the host of Thoughtful Faith, and joining me today is my friend, Brian Stutzman. Brian, how are you?
Oh, it's great to be with you today.
Awesome. Well, hey, give everybody a little bit of an intro to yourself and kind of what you do and how this came together today.
Okay. Well, I live up in Idaho, and I got involved in studying church history 9 years ago. I started studying the mob that killed Joseph Smith and wrote a book called The History of Warsaw, Illinois. And then a couple years ago, we started talking about, who really killed Joseph Smith, and it's pretty cut and dry. It's what the church said. And then, maybe a year ago, I started hearing people complain about some so-called unfulfilled prophecies of Joseph Smith. And my brother-in-law, 20 years ago plus, did one of the best books I've ever seen on this, but he self-published it about the prophecies of Joseph Smith. So I got together with him, and he says, yeah, if you want to republish this, go ahead and do it. I'm kind of busy doing a whole bunch of other things. And so what we've got here is a new book called A Timeline of Joseph Smith's Prophecies, His Prophecies Fulfilled. And it's got an incredible amount of primary sources, incredible amount of prophecies and how they were fulfilled. Most people in the church today, I don't think, even have a clue of even a fraction of the amount of prophecies. And when we talk about prophecies, Jacob, sometimes they are straight out saying, thus saith the Lord, or I prophesy this. Sometimes it's just some comments that, we better do this. And sometimes they're non-conditional, and many times they are conditional. And Joseph Smith kind of fits the profile of what we see in the Bible of prophets. A lot of prophecies are conditional, some are not. A lot of them come to pass in the way that we interpret that they should. And sometimes there's prophecies that people make that don't come to pass immediately. If you think about one of the most famous Old Testament scriptures, Jacob, is in Isaiah, where he says, a virgin shall conceive and his name will be Emmanuel, right? We quote that at Christmas and all this. Are you aware that for 699 years, Isaiah's prophecy was failed? It took 700 years for that prophecy to come to pass.
Yeah, that's true.
Isaiah wrote it 700 years before Christ was born. And then we have like Jonah, who was swallowed by a whale. Mm-hmm. His commission was to go to Nineveh, and he prophesied that the city would be destroyed. That's right in the Old Testament. Mm-hmm. The city was not destroyed. Well, why? Is Jonah a failed prophet? No. The people repented. We don't have a record that was a conditional prophecy, but obviously it was. The people repented. As far as the records we have in the Old Testament. And so you got to really do a hard look at some of the things. If somebody says, well, Joseph Smith said this, but it didn't come to pass. Because I'll show you, for everyone that comes up, there's an explanation. Mm-hmm. But I'll show you 10 that came to pass in a clear manner that you can see and that's recorded. One of my favorites was dealing with Orrin Porter Rockwell. Well, if you don't mind, let's back up a little bit.
Yeah, that's fine. Let's take a step
back.
About
you can't be a sign seeker, and fulfilled prophecies don't necessarily or shouldn't be the foundation of people's testimonies, right? Uh-huh. So let's talk about the Book of Mormon that came through Joseph Smith. People say, well, he's just really smart. He made that up. Well, the Book of Mormon is prophecies, all right. There's prophecies of Mosiah and Alma and the people who wrote that. And then the Doctrine and Covenants actually has about 1,100 forward-looking statements. And as far as this book goes, we categorize the Doctrine and Covenants as the Lord's prophecies through Joseph Smith, but it's the Lord's way. So in this book, what we've got are Joseph Smith's comments recorded, again, primary sources, journals, history of the church, those types of sources, where Joseph Smith's just talking to people, and they either write it down as prophecy or, I heard Joseph Smith say this, or it's Joseph Smith himself.
So these aren't all like "Thus saith the Lord" type properties. In the book, you're dealing with prophecies that a lot of times are just sort of off the cuff things that he had said, but it was in essence like a spirit of prophecy was about him, and
daily,
and that was, and that's something kind of interesting, because we all kind of think of, so there's sort of a conception of prophecy is just like somebody says something and then they predict the future and then the future comes about and it's like, oh, like they did that. And while that can happen, as you've mentioned, conditional prophecies are a thing in scripture. And also these can be more like, you just say what shall be. I think in the preface of the book, you talk about that prophecy is this, it's a broader conception of what shall be. Is that fair to say?
Yeah. In many cases, for instance, and again, let me just get this point here. As people build their testimonies, the testimony should be based first on faith in Jesus Christ and then the restoration, right? And the fruits of the restoration beginning with the Book of Mormon first. This is just kind of a brick in the foundation.
Yeah.
The prophecy should help be faith promoting. And, somebody can get 5 right or 10 right, but when you start getting hundreds of things right, you need to take a look at it. So
that was what I noticed in the book when I kind of went through it, and I haven't read every single bit of it, but what I did read is that there's just this extensive, like one after another, after another, after another, and they go from big things to like small things.
Small things. Let's talk. So again, I spent 9 years studying Warsaw, and that's in Hancock County. And the river between Nauvoo and Warsaw at the time, there wasn't a dam there at Keokuk. And so the rapids, the Des Moines, Iowa rapids, the Des Moines rapids were there. And it was kind of dangerous. The river was dangerous. And just off the cuff one day, Joseph Smith was down by the river and there's some boys swimming and playing. And he just says, hey, look, this is dangerous. I have a feeling that we're going to have some trouble here. Don't swim here anymore, or there'll be a watery grave. And sure enough, 2 weeks later, there was. Now, is that in and of itself a prophecy? Maybe, maybe not. But you start stacking all these little comments and statements. There are definitely where he says, "Thus saith the Lord, I prophesy." And like I said, I really like the one about Willard Richards. This happened in Nauvoo. Excuse me, not Willard Richards, Porter Rockwell. Kind of a folklore in Mormon history. Okay, so on March 4th, Porter Rockwell. Now, you know the story about Governor Boggs. For your listeners that don't know, Governor Boggs was the governor of Missouri. And when the extermination order, he ordered that the saints were going to be exterminated, had to flee the state. And we had millions of dollars of property robbed from us. And the saints basically fled to Quincy, Illinois, right? And Joseph and Hiram and Alexander McCrae and a few others were in the Liberty jail. And later, somebody tried to assassinate Governor Boggs. And they fingered and pointed the finger at Porter Rockwell. Well, Porter Rockwell was down in St. Louis March 4th, 1843, and he was arrested and put in what's called iron hovels and taken to Independence for trial. And on March 15th, Joseph spoke of Rockwell's fate. He said, quote, "I prophesied in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ that Orrin Porter Rockwell will get away honorably from the Missourians." Well, anybody who was watching at the time knew that, or thought that Porter Rockwell was probably not going to get a fair trial.
Yeah,
because
that's a bad, when you're a
um,
Latter-day Saint like Porter Rockwell, who just got rounded up by the Missourians after the assassination of Governor Boggs, that doesn't bode
the
well.
attempted assassination. Yeah. Well, guess what? Rockwell was tried in December 13th, 1843, and the charge of shooting former Governor Boggs could not be sustained, and he was released, just exactly the way Joseph Smith prophesied.
Hmm. What are some of the others from the book that you particularly found
Well,
to be
a lot of
interesting?
a lot of members of the church don't understand that during the Civil War, Jackson County, Missouri, was absolutely leveled in some parts. Some of the bloodiest parts of the Civil War happened in Missouri. We think of Sherman's March in Georgia, and we think of, some of the Battle of Bull Run and outside of Washington D.C. and Virginia, but Quantrell's Raiders just totally sacked parts of Jackson County, Missouri. So here's what's happening. Joseph Hiram, Alexander McCrae, a couple others are in Liberty Jail. And Alexander Donovan, who we know from church history, prominent lawyer, he was visiting Liberty Jail, and he was offered a tract of land as payments by another client. And they were kind of talking about this, and Donovan, when he was visiting Liberty Jail, and Joseph overheard the conversation and said to Donovan, quote, "I advise you not to take Jackson County land in payment of that debt. God's wrath hangs over Jackson County. God's people have been ruthlessly driven from it, and you will live to see the day when it will be visited by fire and sword. The Lord of hosts will sweep it with the bosom of destruction. The fields and farms and houses will be destroyed, and only the chimneys will be left to mark the desolation," unquote. Well,
Wow.
great fulfillment. Quantrell's Raiders, during the Union, during the war, the Union soldiers swept down on Jackson County as well as Cass and Bates counties, killing animals, burning homes and fields, and molesting the inhabitants. Whole areas were plundered, left desolate by fire and sword, and some depopulated. The sufferings of the Missouri people have been thought by many writers to have exceeded the sufferings of the Mormons. And there's a writer, historian in
Wow.
1864 said, "We found houses, barns, outbuildings nearly all burned down, and nothing left standing but the chimneys."
That's crazy. He even says the chimneys.
He even said the chimneys, exactly the way Joseph Smith.
But all right, so these are just lucky guesses, though, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, and that's
So,
the thing.
are you
Any
kidding
one of
me?
them, I think any one of them could be looked at that way. And I think that's what's interesting about the book,
You
is that
get
the book lays out so many things like this that you're kind of like, this is weird.
So let me tell you one last one of my favorites. We all know about the Kirtland Safety Society failing in 1837, right?
Mm-hmm.
And Joseph told the people, this is not going to work if we don't build it upon righteous principles. In fact, he got out of it. Well, the bank failed, as well as about 50% of financial institutions in the United States failed during that Great Depression. And people were mad at Joseph personally. And so much so that he left for Missouri in the middle of the night with his family because they thought he was going to get killed. But he prophesied. He said in 1837 that the Kirtland banknotes would one day be as good as gold. And people are like, "What are you doing? We got all these worthless pieces of paper. The bank failed." Well, 10 years later, that prophecy was fulfilled. What happened
How so?
was the Saints arrived in Salt Lake area in 1847, and they needed a monetary system. And the Mormon battalion who had been in California brought back gold dust, but it was inconvenient and difficult to coin. So they brought out the Kirtland banknotes that people had brought with them. They signed them and placed them on par with gold, thus fulfilling the prophecy of Joseph Smith that the Kirtland banknotes would one day be as good as gold, and it happened within 10 years.
Wow, that's pretty cool. There was another one I saw about stars.
Yeah,
that the
that's
one?
kind of a famous one where he prophesied within 40 days the stars would fall from the heaven. Um, that's kind of a more well-known one, actually. On day 39, there was one of the world's largest meteor showers that had ever happened, and people could go outside in the area that he was in, and it was
Oh,
just a
I
massive
think
amount of stars. Is that the one you're
that
talking about?
one's super. That one's super famous too. Like, if I remember right, I saw somewhere an artist drew it,
Oh,
and they drew that night, just like it was crazy, and it's like a well-known thing. And Joseph literally just before that prophesied that would happen. Now, can we trust the sources on some of these? Like, or are people just making up stories afterwards? Oh, Joseph did all the stuff that he didn't do.
some were written down in a contemporary fashion. For instance, I'm trying to think of it was Heber C. Kimball's son, William Kimball, in a group of 25 people. This is in late 1843, early 1844, where he wrote down Joseph talked to him and a group of 25 people about, and he prophesied that Brigham Young was going to take over the church, and he prophesied several things that Joseph said Brigham Young was going to do. And he said later that as he wrote this down, he says everything that Joseph talked about has come true. That
that was written down.
Well, that was written down after, but there was a bunch of people and nobody disputed it. Nobody came and said, I was one of the 25, and Joseph didn't ever say that.
That's true.
So, again, it's primary sources. It's not hearsay. It's, and that's
so it's interesting too, because, and you had mentioned this partly in the book as well, is the nature of Joseph's character and the people that were around him. One thing I recently kind of looked into that, and what people that knew Joseph said about him. And there are some detractors obviously out there, but there was an enormous amount of people that were kind of just unbelievably wowed by Joseph.
Oh yeah.
But also not in a way that he was so fancy. I remember I think it's the story of Brigham Young meeting him, and he was out chopping wood or something. And he kind of like, you go out and you're like, going to meet the prophet of God. He's out, chopping wood, this young guy. And it's kind of like, this was, he doesn't, in so many ways, he doesn't fit the mold of what you'd think. But then his actions and then these stories that everyone tells about him are, and or told at the time, like you're saying, the contemporaneous stuff, you start to add all this up, and he just is a remarkable figure in history. Like, I think that's something that everyone has to admit.
And, the church, he was a prophet of the restoration. Absolutely. And I think that's why some outside critics felt that after the martyrdom, they predicted in newspaper in New York said, thus ends Mormonism, the death of Joseph Smith. The church, of course, is so much more than one man, and it's the Lord's church. It's not Joseph Smith's church or Brigham Young's or anybody else's. And so he was an incredible contributor to the kingdom of God, but the church survived without him. We can go a lot of directions here. I do want to address. Yeah, go on.
And I was just going to say, though, with Joseph Smith's character and these prophecies that he's doing, they paint the portrait, at least for me, of someone who deserves to be looked into seriously. There's so many people who write off Joseph as kind of, he's just another one of those con men. But
people who do that haven't really spent time researching. There's somebody that said, and we quote him in this book, that none of Joseph Smith's prophecies ever came to pass. Well, you haven't read enough. Or one of the most famous ones is, well, Joseph told several people that they won't die until Christ comes back. Okay. Mm-hmm. Well, he said that before the Kirtland Temple. Well, what happened in the Kirtland Temple? Christ came back. Okay.
Yeah.
They don't understand that we're not talking about the second coming. Or Joseph told several people that they would not taste of death. Oh, they died though. Well, how many types of death are there? There's a physical death, there's a spiritual death, and then sometimes, and in fact, Dr. Covenant's 42, I think it's 46, 42, 46, and through 50, talks about, you know, how well we talk about it in the book, and we explain what that means. You could have a painless death, and that's how you not taste the horrors and the ravages of a horrific, painful death. And the scriptures talk about it. I mean, Jesus himself talked about him returning before his apostles come back for their missions. Mm-hmm. Well, you have to understand what exactly those terms mean and not interpret it too narrowly.
In other words, there are reasons to believe, or yes, there may be explanations for these things that can seem like they are failed prophecies, but the problem is when you count that against all the ones that come true. And that's what needs explaining, right? It's how does he constantly get these things right?
Yeah, you can be smart and not get all these things right. You know, you can be smart enough to make up the book. Well, you can't be smart enough to make up the Book of Mormon, but that's one of the charges. Well, how do you explain this other thing over here?
Yeah.
And then the bottom line is, I really don't think that there's failed prophecies, because we can look at each one and explain. We understand. We explain Jesus's prophecy when he said, "Tear down this temple, and in 3 days I'll build it. I'll rebuild it." He wasn't talking about the temple there in Jerusalem. He was talking about his resurrection. But if you tear that apart, Jesus said he'd build the temple in 3 days. Well, the temple, took Herod. Herod destroyed it, and then the temple we have today in Jerusalem was built in the 1700s, 1800s.
Well, and what is so with regards to some of the claims to failed prophecies, one of them that I hear is that, well, the New Jerusalem is supposed to be in Missouri, right? Yeah. And that was Joseph. He thought that was going to happen, and it didn't happen. Therefore, false prophet, right? What do you say to people who say that?
Well, again, let's go back to Isaiah. He was a failed prophet for 699 years till the 700th year, and Jesus indeed was born. Emmanuel was born. It's going to happen. And when we use terms like, well, in this dispensation or in this lifetime or whatever, we explain this in the book, that's on a spiritual level. It's really a broader time frame than what we give it to today. Well, it was supposed to be in this generation. Well, the scriptures are full of that terminology, and it's more of an eternal talk and eternal viewpoint than just 90 years or 75 years.
Yeah. How about I know that Joseph had made claims about basically like the U.S. government was going to be, because of all the things, they didn't come to the aid of the saints in Missouri, that the U.S. government was going to pay for that and it'd be overthrown and all that. What, people say, we still got the U.S. government, therefore it's still
any charge. You've got to understand that there's been dozens of professors and scholars that have explained and answered that. These are not like some claim that, oh my gosh, I guess the church isn't true. This is the first time I've heard about it. No, these have been debunked and talked about extensively. This one specifically was, many people feel, was talking about the political power in Washington, the political party that was in power at the time in Washington, D.C. And within a short time, I think it's one election or two election cycles, about 95% of those who held power were swept out of office. Their whole political power was
Come on, President Nelson, make one of those prophecies right now. I'd love to see them get swept out.
In the book, we actually cite the source for and the percentages of people who weren't reelected and the time frame. We quote some scholars there that have done a lot of work on this specific prophecy. And so the question today, will do our prophets prophesy? Well, on big things, absolutely, very publicly. You could take President Nelson coming out and saying, you know what, we need to turn to home-centered church. We need to get really good at studying at home the gospel. And man, 6 months later, everything shut down with the pandemic, including church buildings. That was out of prophecy. I think it was. I remember sitting in a priesthood meeting back in 2007, and President Hinckley talked about preparing for upcoming bad times. Well, I walked home, didn't think anything of it, and I'm talking to a very wealthy, prominent man I was actually serving with in the church. And he said, "Did you hear what President Hinckley said?" Well, I said, "Well, yeah, he just said be prepared." And he says, "I heard something different. The Spirit told me that I need to change my investment allocations and become more conservative and be more prepared." I said, "John, that's kind of weird, but that's what I heard the prophet say." Well, what happened in 2008 with the U.S. economy, the housing, and the prophet, was there, and my friends heard it. And so, but we don't have a record. Every day, President Nelson can be saying little things here and there. Maybe we'll find his journal and when the family releases it. We got to remember, people say, "Well, why don't we have all these people's journals?" Well, they're personal. They don't necessarily all the time belong to the church. I understand they've signed agreements to make their writings available later on or something, but President Nelson could be saying things left and right, just like Joseph Smith did. But regardless, what we have here is Joseph Smith had prophetic gifts, and you start studying this, and you can't deny it.
Yeah, that was what impressed me about it more than anything. Looking at the book was the volume of these things. Like there's so many of them, and prophecy. Again, I think that to understand it, you can't. It's like I look at the Family Proclamation as something prophetic.
Oh,
right?
Absolutely.
I even look at President Benson's warning about the nature of Marxism infiltrating society as something prophetic. It isn't necessarily that they're like, hey, on this day at this time. I mean, not saying those things don't happen. Those may be more miraculous. But I look at prophecy, this sort of idea of the spirit of prophecy, that sort of the prophets can see around corners idea, right? That
I totally agree.
That there's a sense in which the prophet has a sense about him that he can understand or grasp something before, like early on, so that we understand it ahead of time. And in that sense, it is prophetic, because when you follow this prophetic guidance, you end up being prepared, kind of the watchman on the tower idea. They just have that ability to make you more ready. And it isn't just in like big world events or whatever, but even just in things in your own life, right? That you'll hear something that a prophet will say that will hit you in a way that gets you thinking about, hey, I need to do X, Y, or Z. And that changes the way things happen in your life for the better. And I think lots of people have those experiences.
They definitely can. I mean, how many times I've heard people say, and it's happened to me, you watch General Conference and you say, man, that talk was for me.
Yep.
How did they know?
Yep, the Spirit will do that for sure. Any other things on here that you want to?
No, I would say so. So we've got two books actually.
Sorry.
The second, what we did here is sell pretty inexpensively. Like I said, any proceeds go to my brother-in-law Pat, and we've got it for the lowest price on an ebook. Just recently revised. There was a few printing errors and typos that made it through the first cut, but what's out there now should be pretty good. But then I took a second. I made a second book, and it's like this book's like $15 or $3 on the Kindle version. But I always wanted to see. And by the way, this book is kind of divided by the eras of church history. Palmyra. And it has a couple pages of what was happening in church history, and then the prophecies. And then we go to Kirtland, a couple pages of basic church history, and then the prophecies. Zion's Camp, same thing. And so it's in chronological order, but I wanted to work by day. So I could look up and say, okay, today is such and such, August 31st or October 1 or whatever. Did Joseph Smith make a prophecy this day? And so regardless of the year, made up another book on this day, The Prophecies of Joseph Smith, also on Amazon. It's like under $10. And so you can just look at, regardless of the year, what day these prophecies are. And it's all the prophecies from this original book. So you can just wake up one day and say, oh, today, I wonder what happened on this date.
Yeah, no, that's really cool. And frankly, good, I guess, addition maybe to your daily scripture feeding to look at some of the things that the prophet Joseph had done, and again, help strengthen our testimonies there. So that's
the whole goal is to be faith promoting, but at the same time, please don't base your entire testimony on whether Joseph Smith said the stars would fall. Okay, it's just the point in the journey of faith building, and we get beat up by our critics, and I don't think we punch back with the truth hard enough. We need to be defenders of the prophetic mantle that Joseph Smith had and the restoration, because it's true.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. This is great. I recommend everybody go check out the book. Again, the book here is a timeline of Joseph Smith's prophecies, his prophecies fulfilled. It has all sorts of prophecies over time that Joseph has made, just a ridiculously long list of them, all backed up in primary sources. You all should go check it out. Super cheap on Amazon. I got it myself. It's on my Kindle. So be sure to go and get it, everybody. So do you enjoy the content here on Thoughtful Faith? If so, be sure to hit the notification bell. This ensures that our new videos show up on your feed. Also, be sure to check out our Facebook group called Thoughtful Saints, where myself and others discuss the sorts of topics found on this channel. And lastly, if you think other people would benefit from this video, please be sure to share it.